Imagine hiking through one of the most isolated landscapes on Earth, 5,000 meters above sea level in the Himalayas. There are no roads, barely any vegetation, and the air is freezing. Tucked into this desolate basin sits a tiny, shallow body of water known as Roopkund Lake. But look closely into that unbelievably clear water, and you will find hundreds of human skeletons scattered across the lake bed. The remains were first officially reported in 1942 by a British forest ranger, and the discovery happened at a moment of extreme global tension, with World War II raging and British officials deeply concerned about an invasion through the Himalayan frontier. The immediate military assumption was that these were the bodies of a lost Japanese unit that had been wiped out attempting a stealth crossing into India. Standing beside a mass grave in 1942, that explanation made complete sense. The geopolitical anxiety of the era provided a highly logical framework to explain why hundreds of people would die in such an impossible location. But the bodies were not from the war. Radiocarbon dating eventually proved the military hypothesis entirely wrong. The bones and organic material appeared relatively recent only because of the environment. The extreme cold and dry conditions at this altitude had effectively freeze-dried the remains, preserving them surprisingly well. In reality, many of these individuals had died hundreds of years before the Second World War even began, which left researchers with a massive problem. If these individuals were not modern soldiers, what kind of catastrophic event could wipe out hundreds of people at exactly the same time? The artifacts scattered among the bones tell a story that has nothing to do with warfare. Instead, investigators found glass bangles, rings, leather footwear, and traditional wooden parasols. Then, researchers noticed a distinct biological marker. Several of the skulls featured shallow, permanent grooves worn directly into the bone across the forehead. People moving through the Himalayas often carried heavy loads using a strap against the front of the head, a tump line. Years of repeating this specific labor actually reshapes the skull. It turns out Roopkund sits near the root of the Nanda Devi Raj Jat, an incredibly demanding Himalayan pilgrimage. The artifacts and boneware reclassify these victims as a mixed group of religious travelers and the local mountain porters hired to carry their heavy supplies. Knowing who died didn't explain how. The answer came from the exact placement of their injuries. Skulls and shoulder bones showed severe, blunt force fractures concentrated entirely on the tops of their heads. There were no sword cuts or arrow wounds on the sides of the bodies. Whatever hit them came crashing down directly from above. The landscape around the lake offers zero shelter. If a rapidly changing storm dropped massive chunks of ice on this exposed route, it becomes a deadly bombardment. Amazingly, local folklore contains an identical story. According to tradition, the mountain goddess Nanda Devi became furious at a group of disrespectful travelers and struck them down with a rain of enormous hailstones. For decades, this stood as a remarkably satisfying conclusion. The physical trauma, the environmental mechanics, and ancient folklore all aligned perfectly to explain a mass death in the mountains. But science hadn't finished asking questions. In 2019, an international team re-examined the remains using high-precision genetic testing and modern radiocarbon dating. This chart maps the age of the skeletons. Instead of clustering around a single day, the remains split into distinct groups spanning roughly 1,000 years. A 1,000-year gap means it is mathematically impossible for one catastrophic storm to have killed all these people. The high-resolution data ruined the neat story we had accepted for decades. The data reveals that the lake is a collection site, gathering victims from multiple, distinct historical events over centuries. Then, the DNA revealed something entirely baffling. While the older group possessed South Asian ancestry, a newer cluster showed genetic origins stretching to the eastern Mediterranean. There is no historical account, recorded expedition, or logical reason to explain a large Mediterranean group traveling at 5,000 meters. The original mystery has been replaced by a much larger one. We now have victims at the bottom of a freezing lake who defy geographic logic entirely. To understand what is actually happening, we have to rethink the lake itself. The environment here is constantly shifting. Roopkund sits at the bottom of a steep basin, acting as a natural funnel shaped by gravity and melting glaciers. Over hundreds of years, different groups passing through the dangerous route above encountered completely unrelated tragedies, and the mountains slowly fed their remains down into the same freezing trap. The story of Skeleton Lake is ultimately a lesson in how real science operates. History rarely packages itself neatly into a single satisfying legend. The deeper we dig, the more complicated the truth becomes, and a perfect answer is often replaced